Good evening, dear friends. It is very nice to see you again in such an incredible number. Beautiful faces, old friends, new friends. Thank you very much for being here with us today. It just so happened that this lecture, dedicated to medicine in ancient Egypt, I almost made a mistake. It in fact continues quite seriously the one that was before it. And despite the fact that these topics are intertwined with each other, I decided to talk about medicine separately. To be honest, the topic is incredibly complex, incredibly interesting. I have not read it for 7 years. I looked at my notes. That is, it is such a significant period, and in order for nothing to prevent us from immersing ourselves in the wisdom of Egyptian doctors and in the absolutely amazing layers of ancient consciousness, I ask you to turn off your mobile phones if you have not already done so, so that our discussion, our conversation would not be interrupted by calls and would not distract you from what we are going to talk about. In the 2nd century of the New Era, the famous author Clement of Alexandria writes about the peoples of the world, what sacred books they owned. He writes that 42 books on sacred knowledge, revealing the secrets of what a person is, were owned by the Egyptians. Of these 42 books, according to the description of Clement of Alexandria, 6 are dedicated to medicine. He describes in detail the special knowledge that the Egyptians had from ancient times, associated not only with medical practices, but also with a special understanding of what the human body is. It must be said right away that from ancient times, namely from the end of the 4th, beginning of the 3rd millennium BC, this sacred knowledge was not just a temple prerogative, it seriously permeated the entire Egyptian society. And then, as I do not get tired of repeating, it happened that in the court of not only the Egyptian king, but also in the court of the earthly king, sometimes it was the king of Babylon, the king of Assyria, or the Persian king. Such examples I will give you. A doctor, a sorcerer, and a foreteller was an Egyptian. And on the one hand, these 3 specialties, of course, within Egypt itself, very actively flowed into each other. And it is often very difficult for us to distinguish one or another specialization, although I will talk a lot about this today. But it should be understood that within the temple schools, we often present with you knowledge that will be a priori religious and which will not be associated with the objective understanding of the world and with those practices that we traditionally associate with medicine. In ancient Egypt, everything was different. Temple schools were amazing sources of knowledge, depending on which deity was dedicated to one or another temple. Temple knowledge had its own specialization. And in a number of temples, which I will talk about today in enough detail, specialization was medicine. Praise to the Egyptian climate, which preserves not only fabric, not only stone, not only wood, but also papyrus. Today, speaking about ancient Egyptian medicine, we will rely on a huge number of sources. These sources have been preserved. These are medical papyruses. These are medical instruments. These are biographies of steles of Egyptian doctors. This is a story about how sometimes an Egyptian doctor went to the earthly court, but then, enriched by the practices of another people, returned to his land. Finally, one more very important element of our conversation and our source for obtaining many facts is the embalmed bodies of the ancient Egyptians themselves, because they have been preserved in abundance. And since the 1940s, the 20th century, their study has been quite active. And a number of European schools First of all, the famous School of Research of Manchester University gave amazing results, which allowed us to imagine how the Egyptians lived, sometimes in what relationships were certain members of the royal family. What did they suffer from? What did they die from? What did they dream about? And how did they treat their doctors? There are a lot of such studies. In fact, of course, at the turn of the 20th and 21st centuries, science proudly began to say that the so-called non-invasive methods appeared. This is very important because we are still talking about the bodies of living people. And today, with horror, sometimes we look at the tickets that were distributed in the best houses of Victorian England in the 19th century, when you could be invited to dinner which had some kind of entertainment behind it. You were expected to unfold a mummy. The mummy was bought, unfolded, some amulets were taken out of it, and then at best these remains were an element of some kind of collection of rarities or curiosities which was in the house where you were invited to dinner. In the worst case, they were thrown out. In the worst case, they were used, as it was quite often in the 16th and 17th centuries, in an unfolded form to make such pseudo-medical ingredients, since the word mummy was confused with the word mumi, not realizing that the resin that was mined in Iranian Nagorny and the bodies of Egyptian nobles of completely different origins. Today, looking at the results of tomographic studies, here's a picture from 2004. It is an amazing opportunity to look at the mummy case, which was made of cartonnage, that is glued layers of tissue of papyrus, which are still tightly reinforced with gypsum and later painted. And finally, let's look at what was inside. Here's the great singer of God Amun, Marissa Mumi, who lived in the 9th century BC. Her body is kept in the collection of the Eastern Institute of Chicago University. And we must pay tribute, first of course, to Europe, that this tendency of careful study of the mummy with the help of the latest technologies. It went further and not further, as in the last year it finally reached Russia. And at the same time, the study of mummies with such non-invasive techniques, they are now being held in the Assembly of the State Hermitage and in the Egyptian Assembly of Museums of the Arts of Pushkin in Moscow. It is too early to talk about the results, but nevertheless, I would like to focus on it, because everything we are going to talk about today is, of course, related to ethics and understanding that, yes, we are talking about the remains of the 3rd to 2nd millennium BC, but they were people. Another very important detail that I would like to talk about at the very beginning. It is not easy for me to read this story because I am an Egyptologist. I would like to apologize to the esteemed doctors. There are wonderful doctors in the audience. It is a great honor for me that you are here today, because of course mistakes in medical terminology are possible, because if you look at it with the eyes of a modern person who's interested in ancient knowledge, I look at it from the other side. I look at it from the point of view of a person who reads papyruses and who, of course, having processed a huge amount of literature, fortunately there is a lot of it in the West, tries to convey this information to us in Russian. Why is it so important to convey? Because traditionally, the idea that modern clinical practice is based on Greek-Roman medicine is extremely widespread. Traditional medicine of Central Asia and the Far East, that is Indian, Chinese, Ayurveda, all these things. And in this vast space of medical knowledge, Egypt remains in a certain silence, although it seems to me more than unfair, because many great doctors of Hippocrates' school, Galen, and many other outstanding minds of antiquity called Egypt the source of their knowledge. And many, such as Plato, Solon, Pythagoras, and many other great minds of the ancient world, they talked about the fact that they studied in Egypt, and even called specific temple schools where their training once took place. If we are talking about Egyptian mummies, it is sometimes the art of the Egyptian balsamist that allows us today to understand in detail what this or that Egyptian was ill with, what this or that king suffered from. The 13th century BCE is one of the most exclusively preserved mummies left from the civilization of ancient Egypt. Menma-Atras, the first one, the outstanding Egyptian king, the father of Ramses the Great. The remains of a man who died for unknown reasons at the age of about 45 are astonishing in terms of how much time they survived, and today, looking at this amazingly pacified face, which would probably be even more perfect if not for the slightly flattened nose. All Egyptian mummies have slightly flattened noses because it was caused by the plumage of the mummy's head. When the strong linseed plumes press the ridge of the nose a little, this face allows us to look at many events of those distant eras. And finally, let's think that Egypt is the only civilization of the ancient world where we can directly see the faces of the great rulers, their relatives, courtiers, and sometimes even the face of a simple Egyptian who did not have money for plumage, but he was buried in the sand of the Libyan desert, which was part of the Sahara Desert, dried his body, and his features were preserved, as sometimes it was not possible for the plumbers to preserve the faces of the great kings. When I will show you mummies today, I will mainly show you the old frames of the beginning of the 20th century. I will explain why. In this case, the preservation is good. On the right is a modern frame of the face of Seti I. On the left is a frame of the mummy when it was found in 1881 in one of the hiding places of the Skalder al-Bahri in Luxor, on the western bank of the Nile in the Fives. Unfortunately, after that, the legacy of the kings continued. At first, they were in the Bulag Museum, which was flooded from time to time. Then, when they were moved from one exposition to another, the mummies were damaged. And often now, these majestic remains of great people, forgive me the tautology, they are not in the exceptional state in which they were found. I think many of you know that in 2020, the Great Egyptian Museum will be located at the foot of the pyramid in Giza. The collection of Tutankhamun, great masterpieces, and many other monuments that we are used to see in the Christian catalogues on ancient Egyptian art will go there. The Odyssey of the Kings will end not there. Already now in the southern suburb of Cairo, not far from the Bulag itself, on the territory of the fortress Fustat, a grandiose national museum of Egyptian civilization is being built, the so-called NMEC. There the history of Egypt will be told from the deep archaic to the revolution that moved Mubarak. And it is there in this museum, already built inside the mausoleum, where the great royal bodies will lie. They will finally get the opportunity to find their honest, transparent box filled with inert gas. And from this moment, the history of the destruction of the great royal bodies, let's call things by their names, will end. And many generations of those who will almost not look at these faces will survive. It was not always so. And now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, there are 2 halls of royal mummies. They were closed in January. Only specialists on special permission could see them. Perhaps there was some truth in this. Because of course, when you see today how tourists in shorts literally crawl through the glass over the body of the great prince, there is some kind of wrongness in this. In the end, for specialists, it's always easy to get permission to study the remains in Egypt. Egypt is a civilization of text and a civilization of the poet. And I will immediately say that every Egyptian doctor was, first of all, a poet. Egyptian texts praised in their teachings the share of the poet. Because he was Merea, a man who loved knowledge. He was Rehet, a man who knows things. Of course, every poet later had a specialization, but only thanks to the precision of Egypt, only thanks to how carefully, throughout the entire civilization, Pharaohs recorded knowledge, including scientific, absolutely amazing evidence. Here is the papyrus of Edwin Smith. This is one of the main texts of ancient Egypt, which conveyed to us their understanding of anatomy and also conveyed to us a huge amount of information on their ideas about surgery. I will show you a lot of medical papyruses today and tell you about the content of these papyruses. But here it is important to understand one more very important thing. In many ways, it is not surprising that this incredible development of medical knowledge in ancient Egypt was, of course, connected with the rituals of mummification, with the rituals of embalming, because there was no fear before studying the human body in Egypt. Moreover, performing the rite, constantly improving the method of embalming, we will talk about this today, Egypt was getting thinner and deeper into the essence of the human body while having a completely rational view. And here I will surprise you very much. I myself was once surprised when I came to this, and this was later confirmed by many studies of my European colleagues. The fact is that the main collection of ancient Egyptian medical texts, such as medical, is exactly medicine. This is the 3rd to 2nd millennium BC. As soon as civilization begins to degrade, medicine is increasingly replaced by magic practice. Less and less explanations, less and less specific examples, less and less specific recipes that should save a person. More and more calls to the world of spirits and recipes for this or that embalming. Yes, of course, Egyptian medicine will never be separated. This is perfectly normal for a traditional society. But I'm talking about the proportion when knowledge comes first, and only then comes the traditional culture, which of course complements this knowledge. I show you a small fragment of this papyrus. In general, its length is 5 meters. This is a colossal collection of knowledge, and in a nutshell, I will tell you about what is here. So, the papyrus of Edwin Smith, judging by the existing data on the handwriting of the writer, on the dating of the papyrus itself, this is approximately 1600 BC. Today it is stored in New York in the Academy of Medical Sciences. And here I will use tips on purpose, because I have a lot of quotes today. 48 cases in which an Egyptian surgeon used to diagnose. Everything is very honest there. And this is also brought up from the very beginning. An example is described, but first the doctors offered a very simple task. This is a disease that I can treat. I know how to treat, and therefore I will treat. This is a disease that I know. I do not know how to treat, and I will consult. This is a disease that I do not know, and therefore I will not treat. It is very important to separate this I do not know from the concept of incurable disease. They also had this. There were quite a lot of diseases in the lists of categories. I will tell you about it today. The doctor begins his examination. The examination began with palpation. There is a term in papyrus, laying of hands. This is not laying of hands, I mean some kind of magic practice, but palpation. When you read a text about a person who has a problem and with the gastrointestinal tract, and in addition to all the descriptions that speak of his problem, one of the descriptions says to the doctor that touching his body with his palms as if the skin was excessively filled with oil and water, that is, an increased sweating. These are absolutely real, amazing moments on which the diagnosis was built first, and then the selection of the necessary treatment. In classical Egyptian medicine, 2/3 of the recipes are always medicamentous treatment or surgical treatment. Yes, I will give you different examples today. Accordingly, 1/3 is, of course, a magic treatment that was an important additional part of medicine. Case 10. They are all numbered. Examination. If you examine a person with a wound above his eyebrows, penetrating the bone, you must feel the wound and remove it with it, applying stitches. Diagnosis. You must say about him that he has an above-brow wound, which I will take to treat. Treatment. After you sew the edges of it, apply raw meat to it on the first day. If you find that the seam of this wound is not swollen, you must close it for him with 2 ribbons, and you must treat it with fat and honey every day until it heals. In fact, inside the recipe, inside the text, there are a lot of interesting figurative expressions which are not at all similar to our European ideas, well, just some philological, how to describe one or another case. For example, a wound has lips and a wound has a throat. And the doctor's task is to sew the lips of the wound so that it does not speak. These are very interesting figurative things. And 2 halves of the central part of the skull have the same term as the shell of a turtle. This is such an absolutely incredible illusion. And there are many examples. I will give you a lot of them today, but for now, a few more cases of Edwin Smith's Papyrus. Case 2, a deep wound on the skull. Diagnosis. You must say about him, he has an open head wound, a case that I will take to treat. Treatment. You must put fresh meat on the first day, and you must put 2 strips of tissue and then treat it with cleaned fat, honey and herbs every day until it heals. Case 12. Examination. If you examine a person with a broken nose cavity and you found the nose bent and the face distorted and a swollen tumour on it, diagnosis. You must say about him, the one who has a broken nose cavity, I will take it to treat. Treatment. Lay him down and clean his nostrils with 2 drops of flax until the last bloodworm. After that, you must make 2 drops of flax soaked in fat and put it in his nostrils. Put 2 pieces of dense rolls of flax on it. Tie it. You must treat it with fat, honey and advice until it heals. Another completely interesting case that attracted the attention of my friends and doctors with whom I discussed the material of this lecture about the displacement of the spine. Examination. If you examine a person whose neck vertebrae are displaced and you found that he does not feel, both his hands and both his legs do not belong to him, but his phallus is irrigated because of this and urine drips from it, and he does not know what it is. Breathing hard, his eyes are filled with blood. These are displaced as neck vertebrae and his vertebrae, making him not feeling both his hands and both his legs. The middle vertebra of his neck is not in place. Diagnosis. You must say about him, he has a displaced vertebra of his neck. He does not feel his legs, hands and urine flows. I will not cure him. I advise him to treat the one who knows more than me. This amazing fragment from the Papyrus of Edwin Smith shows that it's also about the textbook. Yes, traditionally we know that medical knowledge was passed from father to son. This is a family science. Nevertheless, this honesty in relation to the patient literally permeates all the Egyptian medical texts. Of course, the problem was very big. Now perhaps I will surprise many. Before us is Giza, the great necropolis of the 4th dynasty, the frontier of the 27th and 26th centuries BC, the Great Pyramids. But I show not only them, but also these incomprehensible stone structures. In fact, it is about the necropolis of those builders who worked on the construction of the Great Pyramids. We have a huge material, because it's not only about the tombs of the dead. Of course, there are a lot of heavy cases, crushed by stone and exhausted people. It is clear that the work was the hardest. We have barracks where they lived, 2-story. Very decent, by the way, from the point of view of the conditions in which sometimes live those people who come to Russia to work on construction. There were special barns in which not only provisions were stored, but also dried meat, dried fish, a huge amount of onions and garlic, the function of which, of course, the Egyptians knew. And garlic is especially active. It is present in the medical recipe and, by the way, in the spell against evil spirits. And finally, what does not fit in our today's imagination is conveyor bread. Can you imagine how many thousands of people would need to feed it? Therefore, the clay pots connected on special long bases were filled with liquid dough, inserted into a long oven, removed, overturned, inserted again. There are quite a lot of such examples. That is, it was absolutely fantastic for the 3rd millennium before the new era, an established state machine that was aimed at creating the main national construction. Sorry, such an image in Russia sounds quite painful, but think of one very important thing. Every 100 workers had one person who wore the title of Sunu Doctor. The word doctor in ancient Egyptian sounded for the first time in the lecture. There were many titles. I will show you all this today. Think of every 100 people. We know the names of these doctors, and one of the wonderful researchers of Egyptian medicine, John Nunn, whose materials I will recommend at the end of the lecture, he found in various texts, in tombs, in mentions of some receptors, the names of more than 300 doctors. This is more than the rest of the ancient world. It is based on the respect that the Egyptian felt for Sunu, and on this amazing culture, the letter of the tradition of memory in relation to the name, which was certainly a very important part of the Egyptian cultural identity. Of course, this colossal experience that was gained back then in the 26th century BC on the construction of pyramids, on these giant structures that were so famous in Egypt, it was taken into account and accordingly was used in subsequent eras. Another very important thing, the profession of a doctor in ancient Egypt was extremely respected, and for example, in the Chronicles of Monophon, the Egyptian priest who was invited by King Ptolemy I to create the history of the Egyptian state, which unfortunately did not come to fruition, but there are many blocks of it, and they were quoted by later ancient authors. He, for example, describes a very interesting thing that King Jer, the ruler of the 1st dynasty, that is the 30th century BC, was personally interested in medicine, and in his court there was a circle of scientists who studied medical knowledge in other regions of Egypt, far from the capital, and we could not believe Monophon, who was distant from the era of King Jer, for several thousand years, but the fact is that the Egyptian writing tradition in many texts mentions Jer as the king who loved medicine. Teti, the first king of the 6th dynasty, that is the end of the 25th century BC, had a mother, Shesh, who was fond of cosmetology, created unique recipes, well-known recipes for removing pigment spots, and in particular she kept a whole circle of noble ladies who were fond of medicine. And here is another very important thing that needs to be stopped. Not only men's doctors, their education was of course male, but also women's doctors. And we know a whole stele of such doctors and women today. I will also tell you about them today. Honestly, you know, when you look into the depths of the millennium, you understand that maybe sometimes that ancient Egyptian was not so wrong when he said that by changing the heart to technology a person degrades, and they thought history not as a path of development but as a path of certain degradation, because of course everything that was in Egypt at the time of the pyramids is completely incompatible with the early Middle Ages in Europe. And when you look into it, of course, it becomes offensive. The next text, the next wonderful papyrus on which I will stop today, is the famous papyrus, the papyrus Ebers. All papyruses are named in honour of either the owner or the first publisher. I will go back a little. For example, Edwin Smith was once a very large antiquarian. He lived in Luxor. He was great at the art of demotic, that is, reading a simplified Egyptian letter, and therefore the first surgical papyrus bears his name. Georg Ebers was an outstanding German Egyptologist who left behind a colossal legacy, not only scientific but also literary. In Russian, it is translated into wonderful novels from ancient Egyptian life, which are very well written. But one of his most important researches is ancient Egyptian medicine. So, about the Ebers Papyrus, it was bought in 1862. It was brought to Luxor by an Egyptian papyrus on the west bank of the Nile. Well, according to a story, this papyrus was at the feet of a mummy in a sarcophagus. As a result, in 1872, Georg Ebers publishes it. Some summary data. You and I must understand that traditionally in Europe, at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, in order to preserve a papyrus of a very long length, it was cut into such logical fragments called pages, placed between two windows, and thus the papyrus was preserved decently. 110 pages, more than 20 metres long. The 9th year of the reign of Pharaoh Jezreel Karamin of the 1st century, that is about 1534 to the new era, the 16th century, references to more ancient texts. Of course, the author knew these texts well because there are many separate recipes in the text written in sarcophagic grammar. Like if we took some medical prescription and suddenly saw a fragment written in Old Slavic, that's the difference. Accordingly, for an ancient Egyptian, it was not a problem at all. Moreover, on the contrary, it greatly increased the status of the text because it referred it to the most ancient times. 876 prescriptions and recipes for the treatment of wounds, stomach diseases, skin diseases, very complex gynecological cases. The prescribed recipes were made taking into account the Egyptian fragments. I will say a little about the fragments in mathematics today because it is necessary to understand that to create a new medicine, such a fragment was used as 1.64, for example. Further, I will translate the general content of this papyrus. This is a great classic of Egyptian medicine. I think you will be curious. paragraphs 1 to 1.3, magical spells of the evil spirit. From 4 to 85, stomach diseases with an emphasis on parasitic infection. From 90 to 118, skin diseases, wounds, rashes, ulcers. 132 to 164, anus diseases and diet recommendations. 188 to 207, the Book of the Stomach, a complete description of how the Egyptians saw the stomach, its problems, its main diseases, and with descriptions of the main diseases and diagnosis options. 208 to 241, heart diseases. I will stop here, because it was in the papyrus that Ebers first spoke about the human function of the heart. They fully define the logic of the connection of the heart and the vessels. We will talk about the vessels. The only thing is that there is no blood circulation. Respected doctors will correct me. I found information that the function of blood circulation was prescribed only in the 17th century. But at least this connection of blood, vessels and heart was described here in detail. I will quote the text later. 242 to 247. The best medicine of the gods tested by time. A perfect definition of the medical recipe. 247. The medicine of Isis from a headache made for Ra. And this medicine describes a specific headache as a gestep. This is the first mention of migraine, because the same thing was called migraine 261 to 283. Problems of urinary excretion 305 to 335. Cough, sore throat 437 to 476. Hair disease. And here is a completely amazing recipe of using a medicine made on the basis of human placenta to slow down aging. And for aging, by the way, it is described very simply, so that the hair does not turn grey. 482 to 529, burns, torn wounds, pain of limbs. 627 to 696, stress or relaxation. Metu. Ancient Egyptian texts call it vessels. And in the papyrus of Ebers for the first time, the situation is described when a stone is formed inside the metu. That is the calcination of the artery. They knew it. 697 to 704. Tongue diseases. 708 to 721. Skin diseases. 739 to 750. Teeth and stomatology. 761 to 781. Mouth, ear, nose and throat diseases. And 783 to 839. Gynecology. When you read all this and understand the essence of this text, there is nothing in Russian at once, but everything is written in English. It is absolutely amazing how these temple schools succeeded in the knowledge when you understand some century BC. I'll show you a few more pages of the Papyrus of Ebers. This is how it is stored. It is located in Leipzig. One more page. And thus, with the first such contact, we get acquainted with a very versatile medical textbook. Not all the texts with the main ones, of course. Only with the main papyruses I will introduce you have been preserved so well. Nevertheless, the interest is incredible, because in front of you is the Cajun papyrus, which was associated with the diagnosis and treatment of female diseases. Yes, the fragmentariness is quite large. This is a small piece of text, that is, we understand that I'm showing you fragments. In fact, these are large scrolls. So a few words about the Cajun papyrus, found by the great father of British archaeology, William Matthew Flinders Street Peter, in 1889 in the ancient town of Hoodhead Epsom Usart. This is about 150 kilometres south of Cairo. This is the 29th year of Pharaoh Amenemhet III. This is one of the oldest medical texts. This is the 1825 to 19th century, before the new era. 34 paragraphs. 17 is the name of the disease and the description of the symptoms. 8, unfortunately, due to the state of the scroll, are not readable. 19 is the diagnosis of the pregnant. 20 is the vaccination of the pregnant. 2022 is the contraception. 26, 32 is the pregnancy test. I will tell you a little more about this, how it looked. 33 is the pain in the legs during pregnancy and the ways to help women. And 34 are the things related to certain intimate zones, and accordingly the specifics of their treatment. As for the pregnancy tests, because of course I see with my own eyes, everyone became terribly interested. What is that? They were studied in detail in Germany in the 80s. The point was that they took almost virgin soil. What does virgin soil mean? Basically there is sand and a minimum of soil. They took a certain kind of wheat and a certain kind of barley, the simplest, the most ancient cereals. They are watered with urine of a woman, and accordingly the desire to know whether she is pregnant or not. They did quite specific normal medical and modern studies of these texts that gave the following. Indeed, of course, the result is not 100% at all, approximately 60 to 65% of success. But if a woman is not pregnant, then in the specified period there are no rises. If she is pregnant, because accordingly there are already corresponding proteins in the urine, then the rises accelerate and they appear at the specified time. If she is already on a significant period of pregnancy and she wants to know the sex of the future baby, then the greater growth of barley is most likely in favour of the boy, the greater growth of wheat in favour of the girl. I remember a good figure of 32 examples successful according to this ancient recipe. Turned out to be 22. Not bad at all for the 19th century to the new era. In addition to such understandable examples, there are a lot of examples that do not match modern medical concepts. For example, a lady who wanted to know if she was pregnant or not, she had to take an onion of a certain variety, peel it, put it in the vagina, and then the result depended on whether she felt the taste of the onion in her mouth the next day. Modern medical studies do not evaluate this recipe, that nothing like this can be, but nevertheless such a practice was, and in fact examples of such recipes that do not match modern medical concepts within Egyptian medicine are also quite a lot. Another papyrus which I want to talk about so that you now operate with quite serious sources. And this is the famous medical papyrus Hearst. It was found in 1901. It was found by a peasant who, apparently in the burial of some priest passionate about medicine, found a whole medical library. And what is unexpected, Egyptians often place their favourite literary texts in their tombs. Some personal correspondence, naturally, magic texts in abundance, but medical texts placed in the tomb and not passed on to the next generation of doctors. In general, in Egypt, this practice is quite uncharacteristic. Here is a whole library. Accordingly, it is also very ancient, about 2000 BC. What is in it? 250 prescriptions for the treatment of broken bones, fever, dysentery, bleeding, edema, diseases caused by parasites, heart disease, aneurysms, liver disease, diabetes, intestinal incontinence, gastrointestinal diseases, respiratory diseases, inflammation of the lungs, burns, ulcers, pimples, inflammation, hypotension, gout, ear disease, nose and throat, gonorrhea, impotence, and finally bites from an insect, and, Lord have mercy, from a hippopotamus. Further, at the end of the text there is a special cosmetic section in which you can find instructions how to get rid of wrinkles, get rid of pigment spots, remove birthmarks, dye hair and eyebrows, enhance hair growth, and so on. Accordingly, the doctor, using the advice of this papyrus, could prescribe pills, a mixture, a patch, a dressing, an ointment, rinsing, inhalation, and smoking. And very often this smoking is in addition to some more serious medical treatment. That is, the smoking was given great importance by the Egyptians. Accordingly, as medicine, the papyrus mentions medicinal plants, mineral substances, substances of organic origin. The medicines are very complex in the recipe and are mainly built on the immersion of ingredients in milk, in honey, in various types of fat, both vegetable fat and animal fat. We must immediately remember that the ancient Egyptians did not even take a step to the race, to the end of their civilization. They did not know the race, and therefore, in general, all these inoculations were most often made on a purified olive, sesame oil, or on the oil of the balanet of the seabed. When we think of milk, we immediately imagine cow's milk, but this is not the case at all. The most famous milk that was used for Egyptian cosmetic recipes is Assyrian milk, because it is not very high in fat, and there are some, according to modern medicine, components that really have a positive effect on the skin. I will give one example. It is interesting that you understand how complex the recipe is. This is a recipe that, in fact, ascends to the name of the mother of the king of Athens, a noble lady named Shesh. Assyrian milk was taken. Then, of course, in certain days of the lunar calendar, without this, no way, in a certain lunar calendar, emmer was taken, which was ground. A cake was kneaded, extracts of 16 types of herbs, which accordingly were included in the already formed dough. Then the cake was baked in a tandoor to such an extent that the crust turned out, but inside the cake was raw, and then the cake was put on a steam bath. Drops of oil appear on the surface of the cake. This oil was used to remove pigment spots. This recipe was very interested in the house of Eleanor Rubinstein. The recipe is working. Indeed, of course, this is not a miracle, but nevertheless, for Africa, where the strongest sun, where traditionally ladies still suffer from the sun's rays, it really turned out to be a working remedy. Since I remembered a little bit of cosmetics, I will also say that separate elements of Egyptian recipes were studied before the malarial, and also, quite successfully, some herbal ingredients were taken. I think the main problem of this colossal complex of knowledge is that, for example, you have a complete recipe. You just understand that everything is fine. You will do it now. But what is a piston plant? A big question. Accordingly, already mainly on the basis of later sources, texts of Greek Roman times, on the basis of Dioscurida and his works, parallels were made that made it possible to understand what kind of medicinal herb that particular recipe meant. And when there are 16 or more, we understand that it is just an element of translation, not an element of the fact that in the classical understanding of this word, Jaberia, we did not reach the Egyptians. There are separate images, separate comments. At one time, the outstanding Danish specialist Lise Manning was engaged in this. Much has been established, but we do not know more. So to sum up a little what I am talking about. Today I am now showing you a list of the main papyruses, the most famous, and in fact there are many hundreds of them. Edwin Smith, New York. This is surgery. Ebers, a great universal book. Cajun Papyrus, Hurst Papyrus. Chester Beatty Papyrus, which is kept in the British Museum, which is fully dedicated to proctology as a separate doctor's specialisation. Berlin Papyrus, general information therapy. London Papyrus, about 1300 BC, but it is more magical. Carlsberg Papyrus 8, Carlsberg Foundation, this is Copenhagen Gynecology. Ramesseum Papyruses 3, 4, 5. They were found under the foundation of Ramesseum, the late temple of Ramses the Great, and all come from the same tomb. A man who was clearly a doctor but also practiced magical practices. He had a lot of unusual things found in the tomb. Gynecology, ophthalmology and paediatrics. Yes, ophthalmology and paediatrics were in Egypt. Papyrus London and Leiden. It is called so because the Swedish consul Anastasia, who was the owner, thought that these were two scrolls, but in fact it was a broken papyrus. Therapy, magical practices. The papyrus from the city of Krokodilopol, which is kept in Vienna. General information therapy. And a separate, very interesting scroll. This is the Brooklyn Snake Papyrus. 300 BC, snake bites and description 24 types of snakes with a description of their appearance, structure of teeth and of other respectively on each snake clarification. It can be treated, it cannot be treated, if treated, then how, or it is fatal. Summarising a little, at least the first scroll which we need to talk about, I quote a small fragment from the Papyrus Ebers, which is just associated with the function of the heart, which was first identified by the Egyptians. The beginning of the secrets of the doctor, the knowledge of the course of the heart, from which the vessels go to all the members, for every doctor, every priest of the goddess Sekhmet, every spellcaster, touching the head, the back of the head, hands, palms, legs, everywhere touches the heart. From him are directed vessels to each member of the body. Amazing evidence of such a scientific breakthrough. But on the other hand, since I focus on the heart, I am in this place. Probably it will be fair, I will say a very important thing. The Egyptians were completely superficially related to the functions of the brain. Moreover, the function of the spinal cord, they determined, because it was associated with the paralysis, and there were a lot of such examples. But in their assessment, the brain prevented them, that the Egyptian religious dogma considered the brain the substance in which the memory of life is preserved. This is the only part of the body that is ejected during embalming. And as you know, the hooks are removed through the nostrils during the process of mummification. The function of the brain, according to the well-known sources before the school of Hippocrates, was not determined. The only important point, which I would also like to emphasize in front of you, because it is the chosen accidentally preserved links, and a lot of things firstly can be discovered, secondly they may have been, but the sources have not been preserved. I still hope for the first, because literally last year a new link was found that described in detail the function of the kidneys. At the same time, in all these links, the kidneys are not described at all. And by the way, the kidneys are left by the Egyptian embalmers in the body during mummification, and it was always believed that there was no idea about nephrology in ancient Egypt. But no, a palimpsest was found, that is, a papyrus on which there were several layers of various texts, and the oldest of them, which dates approximately the end of the 12th century BC, it was dedicated to the function of the kidneys and some such approximate observation, which still fits in the idea of nephrology. Let's go deeper. I'll show you now several illustrations which should actually demonstrate one very interesting thing. How detailed the Egyptian describes the structure of the body. I do not urge you to read the transliteration, that is what is there. Here is an image of a person, parts of the body, and next to each part you see hieroglyphic writing and writing of transliteration. That is the Latin translation, which is traditionally used in Egyptology. Moreover, here you need to emphasize one more interesting detail. In Egypt, there is a single, multiple, and a double number. So there are many double numbers. The collarbone is both 2, the arms are both 2, the legs are both 2, and so on. The Russian equivalent is given only where it's possible to confuse. That is here, let's say the term Nehabet is the neck, and then another term it shows the throat. Then in principle everything is quite clear. Here's even a separate term for the nipple, separate terms for the intestines. That is, of course, they knew the structure of the body very, very well. In order to confirm their really special knowledge in medicine, I will show you not only such a section of the internal organs of the human body, I will show you their terms associated with the skull. A very funny translation, I put it here and there. You see, lit, that is a literary term. Rope, temporal muscle. Packet, the upper part of the skull, which is exactly in accordance with the word packet of the skull, what I told you about. Nose chambers, what concerns the nostrils, with various parts of the lower jaw, also has its own names. Temporal bones and so on. That is in general, the description is more than detailed. Well, the N. The third example, which I think will also be interesting, is the female-male sex system. Very curiously, in ancient Egypt, the female uterus is called Mutramic, literally the mother of humanity, the mother of humans in many ways. A very clear description. There's a uterus neck, a uterus mouth, respectively, the flesh, and so on. The embryo also had its own names, as well as the placenta. The literal name of the embryo, Suhet, is a literary egg, which also seems to me quite clear, especially for an ancient man. Well, the male sex system is also shown here in detail. And of course, the understanding of the Egyptians of the logic of the vessels that go through the body is exclusive here. I will now stop for a moment and comment on this. This is more difficult than we are used to talking about it with you. In the category of the uterus vessels include arteries, veins, fragments of the nervous system, veins, in general everything that is long, stretches, and that looks like a tube. Literally, the uterus is a tube. And here in Egypt there was a very important mistake that was, in fact, in many classics of ancient medicine. They believed that the method transmitted not only blood, not only veins, but also, for example, air. In surgical papyruses, it is commented as that at the time of the anatomical examination of the body in the arteries, there was very little blood, as they explained to the pathologist of anatomy. Yes, indeed, after the death of a person, blood leaves the arteries very quickly. But at the same time, they found a calcination there. And they thought that this is the method which is filled with air, therefore both liquid and air. Nevertheless, it's curious that in this papyrus of Edwin Smith, it is commented, for example, the breath of a person, that a person breathes air into the method which goes to the lungs, and only from there, from the lungs to other methods, air goes, for example, to the heart, and the heart distributes air to other parts of the body to other vascular systems. In principle, if we still allow that this is the second millennium before the new era, that is, if we replace the word air with the word oxygen, then everything will be quite organic. Everything is quite understandable and very worthy. The concept of the method was based on the Egyptian understanding of the body. There's one thing that modern doctors cannot comment on and say that it is very strange. But for some reason in Egypt, it was believed that all the methods based on the heart, and in fact the entire blood system, end at the anus, and all the methods end at the anus. This ending at the anus is confirmed by many Egyptian medical texts, which accordingly does not correspond to the modern medical map of the human body. Let's move on. I'll show you a few more bodies. In my opinion, it is very beautiful. It's amazing. In a nutshell, I showed you the king and the queen. Let me show you the queen. This is an exceptional mummy. My friends, this is the 14th century BC. This is Thea, the beloved wife of Menhotep III, whom you all know as the St. Petersburg Sphinx. This is Tutankhamun's grandmother, a miniature woman, 1.62 meters, if my opinion does not change. Her height, incredible posture. The body was not just embalmed, it was gilded. She had a fantastic manicure made of lacquer based on cedar wood resin, which was brought to Egypt from the territory of Phoenicia, that is the territory of modern Lebanon. It was primarily red because Egyptian ochre was mixed, traditional Egyptian red, but not open red, but terracotta clay. Egyptians loved it very much. You will often find this colour rare cases, not amazing here. I deliberately show the frame of 1898. This is a frame made by the great French archaeologist Victor Loret when he found Thea in a hiding place in one of the side chambers of the tomb of Pharaoh Menhotep II. Several bodies of the greatest kings and queens. Unfortunately, one detail cannot be missed. In these gorgeous hair, despite all the love of the Egyptian hygiene, there were rascals. She had lice. Therefore, it becomes clear the abundance of medical prescriptions on how to get rid of parasites. There were a lot of parasitic infections, even in the case of the Queen. Unfortunately, she did not avoid it. Yes, amazing manicure, golden body, but such a problem. Therefore, traditionally, the Egyptians, as a sign of ritual purity, especially priests, and as a sign of natural hygiene, they shaved their hair. They shaved their hair both on the head and on the body quite actively. In rare eras, men's moustaches were fashionable, not often enough, but at the same time there was such a great passion for hygiene that 2 shavings a day was a must. There was such a composition of swab. This is an ancient analogue of toothpaste. This is a mixture of fragments of palm oil, very strongly filtered with natron. Natron is a natural combination of soda and salt. In Wadi al-Natrun, in the bitter lakes in Egypt, it is extracted a lot. In ancient times, this substance was called necarite divine. This is what was the main substance used by the Egyptian balsamists. The mixture of soda and salt removes fat, dehydrates the body. We'll talk about balsam, but nevertheless, all cleaning agents, including such a liquid paste, liquid soap, which was known by several sorts, which was also built according to this principle. It, of course, included odours, fats, but necessarily natron. But at the same time, here is such an example of a rather big problem that the Queen faced. Due to the fact that her life was very long, very bright, she was one of the most straight as a cane in the last years of her life. And traditionally, unexpectedly, for ancient Egypt, traditionally, they have a lot of problems with teeth. It is explained very simply. How is Egyptian bread made? It is made on a grater, my friends. That is, in Egyptian bread there's always a small premise of star. Therefore, teeth were washed very actively. I will show several such examples. And here, plus sweet honey, dates. This is for a kind soul. But the queen apparently understood the essence of the problem well and wanted to stay beautiful until deep years. And this is one of the famous beauties of the ancient world. She has absolutely amazing teeth preservation. That is, apparently she was very clear about her diet, because such an unprecedented case of teeth preservation, of course, amazes. The end of the 13th, the beginning of the 12th century before the new era, the Queen Tausert, who even ruled for about 6 years as a pharaoh of men, she took the throne. Fashionable hairstyle and absolutely delightful preservation. It seems that she really fell asleep. If the nose had not been slightly flattened, the face would have been quite perfect. Big problems with deposits of mineral substances in the spine area, arthrosis, and here, on the contrary, a very poor condition of teeth. She was a sweet tooth. This is very clearly shown. You know, it's absolutely incredible, because you're talking about the tastes of a person who lived at the end of the 13th, at the beginning of the 12th century, before the new era. But the preservation of the body is certainly incredible. And the third example, the third wonderful lady that I will show you today, is one of the most famous mummies of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. She has not been exhibited for many decades. She will appear in the halls of the new great museum of pyramids, the great priestess Nezithine Beit Sheru. This is the turn of the 9th and 8th centuries before the new era. Her eyes are encrusted with obsidian and limestone. Her body is tinted with yellow ochre, that is a fashionable colour of light tan. Her hair, if the preservation of the body is exceptional, because it was all sprinkled, in addition to the traditional embalming techniques. I will talk about them a little later, rubbed in a powder with the moringa tree. This is a very popular tree in Egyptian medicine, which in particular was used to fight any parasites. Well, considering that it is the highest embalming technique, here you can see this composition carved from the moringa tree. Of course, it gave her the opportunity to be preserved. At the end of the 19th century, Europeans, during what was called literally winter in Egypt, they specifically went to see the great priestess Nezithine Beit Sheru, because she was an example of such an incredible preserved beauty of the ancient Egyptian woman, despite the past 1,000 years. An amazing portrait. She was well preserved. I saw her once in my life in a closed room on the 3rd floor of the old museum in Tahrir Square. They will exhibit it. So after 2020, you will be able to see and appreciate this amazing, melancholic, sad face. In a nutshell, I will say about the embalming technique. I think that since you came to the lecture on medicine, you're not afraid of any details. There is nothing wrong here. The insides were removed through a cut in the right part of the lower abdomen area. Absolutely all the insides except, as you already know, the kidneys, which were left in the fat deposits that surround them. Then accordingly they realised very early that the decomposition of the body begins with the intestines, so the intestines were removed, and then all the insides were placed in these vessels called canopies, which for many centuries have been a symbol of the Egyptian tomb, of the Egyptian burial. In fact, the heart, as you and I know, after the necessary preparation, a certain balsam was usually dipped in resin to preserve its integrity. It was placed back in the mummy because the heart for the ancient Egyptians is a source of thoughts, emotions, knowledge, and it is a kind of vessel filled with deeds of eternal life. Therefore, on the tomb of the gods, on the great celestial Jat, as it's called, the heart will be weighed on great scales, comparing it with the weight of the ostrich feather of the goddess of true hell, in the presence of the great Osiris, the great god of immortality and the lord of another world. The canopies were not always so classic, but first we will talk a little about them. Now you see the canopies of the 7th to 6th century BC are from the Museum of Art in Boston. Let's open them. Accordingly, the lids are a happy pavilion which is protected by one of the 4 great goddesses of the deceased. In this case, it is Nephthys. The lids were put in such a canopy. With the head of the falcon of the sons of Kibs, he is patronized by the goddess Selkit, and inside the rabbit is the intestines, Dua Mutef. With the head of the jackal, he is the great son of the goddess Neith, the great-great-grandmother of the gods, and this vessel is put in the stomach. Accordingly, with the head of the man, the spirit of Msiti, he is patronized by the great Isis, the wife of Osiris, and the liver is put there. In fact, in the process of embalming, one very important thing was violated for the Egyptians. This is the integrity of the body. That is, there was no ban on the study of the body, but the violation of integrity was made by the person who was considered unclean after that. Traditionally, he portrayed during the ritual drama, embalming was theatricalized by the god of chaos, the sand of the desert, who once killed Osiris. He did this embalming with obsidian, most often with a blade, and then, accordingly, this whole process was already going on. The task was not just to save the body for the time before the transformation with the subtle essence of a person. The mummy should not go in, go out, or live in any way. This is just what allows the soul of the deceased to comfortably exist in the afterlife without suffering from the decomposition of the body. They believed that from the decomposition of the body, while the soul wanders through the first areas of this world, it can experience torment and horror. Then the canopies were not always like this. Basically, such canopies with caps in the form of heads, spirits, as we sometimes call them. The sons of Horror, they were in the first millennium before the new era. Initially, the canopies were very simple. This is the oldest preserved box for the canopies. It belonged to Queen Pharaohs I, the mother of the great Khufu, whom you know as Cheops. This is the 27th century before the new era. Then, in the 1920s, the outstanding American archaeologist George Reisner found the secret tomb of the mother of Khufu. Among the incredible wealth, palanquins, furniture and jewellery, there was this box for the inside of the Queen. Here you see both a modern frame made in the Cairo Museum and a historical frame from 1825. And you can see that they turned into ash and water penetrated into the tomb. So at first, without much research, these 4 containers were always connected with the sides of the world, with the insides of the deceased. A very beautiful and ceremonial version is the canopy of Tuya, the mother of Queen Tea, which you have already remembered. This is the great-grandmother of Tutankhamun. In the 14th century, before the new era, there were also sculptures of the deceased and the insides. By the way, here's a very beautiful new exhibition in the Cairo Museum. The treasure of Tuya and her husband Yu replaced the gallery where Tutankhamun used to stand, which is now being transferred to the new museum. Here In the foreground, you see the insides of Tuya's body, on which a small semblance of a funerary mask. First, there are simple canopies, then there are vessels with the heads of the deceased, and only in the first millennium before the new era, there are 4 spirits that become lids. Nevertheless, since ancient times, the names of the canopies of the names of the goddesses. Speaking of embalming, I must mention that the main source of our embalming is still Herodotus, the great father of history, who in the 5th century before the new era visited Egypt and described the practice of embalmers. There were 3 ways of embalming. The most expensive one, which lasted 70 days, which was compared to the fact that Sirius, the great star of Isis, cannot be seen for 70 days in the sky. When the brain was removed, all the insides were removed. In the case when the body was very full, incisions were made, and dry natron was literally rubbed into these incisions in order to fatten the body as much as possible. A very simple one was that an anal hole was filled with reddish juice. The body lay there for some time. Then all that was formed was poured out of it and buried in the sand. The gradation here depended on what the family of the deceased. In the Archaeological Museum of Marseille, an amazingly touching thing. A fisherman was buried there, and apparently the whole family was really strained. They provided him with a decent way of embalming, but there was not enough money. They took a sail from his boat without removing the takelage, cut it into long sails, and he went to another world wrapped in a sail of his own boat, which he once sailed on the Nile. Such a sad, romantic, very beautiful story, because all this was very expensive. And when in the first millennium before the new era, we have the description of the cost of the burial, up to 40% of the cost was spent on the mourners. These were professional mourners or mourners, it could be both. It was very expensive. But this ritual of farewell was very important for a person, as the Egyptian text said, to pass the death crossing. Because death was associated with the river, our life is with the eastern shore. Eternal life is with the western shore, where, according to legend, all the souls go. I can't, of course, finish my story about the canoes without showing the great masterpiece of Tutankhamun's canoes. This is exceptional. This is incredibly beautiful. And this is, of course, an incredible apotheosis of the royal burial ritual. The frame on the right is made by an outstanding pseudo-artist, Harry Burton, an employee of the Metropolitan Museum, who shot for Howard Carter the whole history of his great discovery. 4 lids, 4 goddess keepers on the sides. One of the lids is now in front of you. This is an alabaster, and this is, in my opinion, an absolutely unearthly beauty. And in turn, if you take out each lid from this alabaster ark, then you find a hole there. And inside this hole, there are such golden arches in which the insides were placed. Inside, all the arches are covered with texts of prayers, and accordingly against the clock hand, these arches were watered with a special composition of holy oils. Against the clock hand, this is a symbol of death. Around the clock hand, around the ark, a goddess dances, a sign that life will overcome death. Well, this is such an absolute apotheosis, of course, which miraculously came to us only in the tomb of Tutankhamun. We do not always look at Egyptian art and are ready to imagine that it is not only not static, it is not static at all. It sometimes depicts what was forbidden by the main Egyptian concept of imagery. An Egyptian leaves forever something, well, I will say positive, the most beautiful, the best, the most perfect, what should live forever. But there were exceptions. And here, of course, probably the brightest example is the scene of hunger. This is a fragment of the relief of the processional road in front of the pyramidal temple of the king Unas. This is the 25th century BC. Here, in the chronicles of this king, in fact, these are such embodied in the stones of the chronicle, a terrible situation is reflected when Egypt was starving because the Nile flood, which was the source of food for Egypt, it was always stable. That is, if the Nile flood is low, then the upper fields are left without water. This is hunger. If the Nile flood is high, then it washes out the barns. This is also hunger. Therefore, here, of course, the picture is terrible. And I will say right away that I did not spend much time on the conversation about the food of the ancient Egyptians, although this is actually important. The provision was very simple, but such cases during the study of mummies, they are quite pure. That is, it is often an infant mortality, high at the time of hunger, and such misfortunes that not only Egyptian art but also Egyptian archaeology often record. Several examples of specific diseases and what the ancient Egyptians faced on the bodies and on the images. Here's the mummy of Nespaheran, the priest of the god Amun, who lived in the 11th to 10th centuries BC. He has a classic example of spinal tuberculosis. His spine almost collapsed, which caused this incredible hump, and in the right part, in the frontal photo, there are traces of a massive abscess, which the poor man, and he lived a very long life, judging by the teeth, suffered incredibly. This is one of the brightest examples of the existence of tuberculosis in ancient Egypt, because, as you understand, balsamic lungs and canopies turn into a certain mass that is impossible to explore, but spinal tuberculosis was. Fortunately, it is not so often that it's found on mummies. This example is probably the most famous. Also about bone changes and about problematic infectious diseases in this regard. A wonderful monument is the late stela of Mr. Roma, who was an adjutant of the temple of the goddess Shtaret in Memphis in the 13th century BC. Judging by his image, he suffered from poliomyelitis. There are Egyptian mummies, I will show you in a minute, which show that this is a quite real image. It is so hard to lean on a stick. Nevertheless, he is accompanied by his wife, his favourite house gazelle, and even a child. But there are such things. And here, of course, it is curious what attention the Egyptian artist pays to the person depicted. Maybe there is also the position of the client himself. This stela was made on request. Mr. Roma wanted to be depicted in a different way than he really was. The most famous case of poliomyelitis in the Egyptian history is the mummy of King Sapta, a young man who ruled in Egypt in the 13th and 12th centuries BC. Here you can see everything related to the foot. I will say right away that this diagnosis, that this is a trace of poliomyelitis, was made not so long ago. Various versions of the deformation of this limb were assumed by doctors who studied the royal mummies, starting from the famous Dr. Derry, an Englishman. Derry participated in the unwinding of the royal mummies in Cairo at the end of the 19th century. About dwarfism, about dwarfs. There were a lot of dwarfs. The Egyptians loved dwarfs. This is a court dwarf, not some other dwarf. He is a lord. This is Mr. Seneb. He was a court dwarf in the reign of the last kings of the 4th dynasty, and that is from the beginning of the 25th century BC to the end of the 4th, beginning of the 5th. Look how brilliantly the artist came out of his position depicting him exactly the same in height as the wife who did not have this problem, and 2 children. By the way, there were 3 children. The 3rd child is still mentioned on the statue. 3 absolutely full-fledged children. Here they are as a sign that they are not yet 5 years old, depicted with a finger of the mouth. This is a canonical depiction of a child. A court dwarf was a favourite creature. On the one hand, it is the person who entertains the king. On the other hand, it is not a shoot at all. By the way, there was never a shoot in the Egyptian court because the dwarf is the bearer of magical powers. The Egyptian idea of a human assumed that in fact everyone is given a talent, but someone finds his talent, someone does not find it. In fact, every person can show himself. But in the case if a person has an organic defeat of some kind, that is a serious ailment, or he was born, for example, with dwarfism, then he is given another additional entity, Heka, a magical power. Such an attitude to dwarves, by the way, is traditional for all cultures of tropical Africa, not only for ancient Egypt. Therefore, in Egypt, dwarves were often outstanding jewelers because the jewellery art involved the combination of mysterious symbolism of the material, pouring spells into gold, reciting spells on these materials, that is constant work with a magical power, which, as you remember, ancient Egyptians called Heka. It is necessary to separate 2 types of dwarves. That is, there are dwarves, there are pygmies. Pygmies are completely different. This is in accordance with tropical Africa. Pygmies were brought during the expeditions, but dwarves, those who were born with this thing, they were considered very beloved, very revered creatures, and they were afraid because of their magical potential. This allowed many dwarves to make a brilliant court career. On the left, this is my favourite dwarf, Numkatep. This is also the 5th dynasty, the 21st century BC. This is a very respected person. This is a statue that was made with the permission of the king so that he would live forever. And this statue was in his tomb. And finally, another example from the tomb of the nobleman Nean Khnum and Khnum Katep, who in the court of the king Nusera, also in the middle of the 3rd century BC, took the posts of the chief in manicure and the chief in wigs, such court hairdressers. And one of them is carried on a palanquin, and below is the favourite dwarf. The name of the dwarf is signed, and here, of course, all the features of this innate deformation of the body can be seen. Well, due to the fact that the topic is actually very rarely raised when we talk about ancient Egypt, I will now show you what the sarcophagus of the court dwarf looks like. Well, in general, I could envy the middle-handed nobleman. This is very serious. The 4th century BC is the dwarf, whose name was Jethor. He was the favourite dwarf of one of the kings of the 30th dynasty. And here is just a vertically placed cover of the sarcophagus. Believe me, the bottom is also just covered with amazing images of the text about the tomb in the world. And on the other side of the cover, there is a huge figure of the goddess Nebinut, which the dwarf must protect in her tomb. That is, the dwarfism was he was revered and was treated with great respect and interest. Also about such organic changes associated with different parts of the body. This is hydrocephaly. This man was about 30 years old, and so that you understand, the diameter of his skull is 66 centimetres, as indicated by my medical sources with which I consulted, instead of 55, which is the norm. That is a significant increase. And while the skull is huge, while the natural proportion of the face is preserved, due to the fact that the entire mummy has been preserved, There are traces of him dragging his legs, and he was constantly leaning on a stick, which just literally, before the ulcer, caused him such a problem on the chest. Approximately the same image of the 20th century is kept in the British Museum. This is the stela of the wizard Entif. In fact, in Egyptian art, the elongated shape of the skull was considered beautiful. That is, one should not be afraid of it. But such a specific example of hydrocephalus I will show you as a clear problem. Sometimes, of course, it's very difficult looking at Egyptian art to say what a person suffered if there is no specific mummy. Here is the stela, which is kept in the Berlin Museum. This is an outstanding person. This is the sculptor Bach, who made all the first images of the famous pharaoh and reformer Akhenaten. His student Thutmose created the well-known bust of Nefertiti in a blue wig. Bach is depicted together with his wife Tahiri. Here, on the one hand, the knees are covered, such a huge stomach, and at the same time, there is no image of a butt in Egyptian art. Therefore, several researchers assume that, in fact, here is depicted not so much a cloudiness as a fibrous change of the liver in individual remains, where sometimes internal organs were not removed. There are examples of such diseases. On the other hand, there may be a third thing, a brilliant official going on his career, a master, a respected person. He is depicted in Eastern culture as a complete man with some fat folds. And of course, speaking of obesity, I can't help but show a masterpiece. This is, in my opinion, a fragment of the relief from the temple of the pharaoh of woman Hatshepsut. Her ships went on a military trade expedition to the country of Punt. This is the territory of modern Somalia. From there they brought not only peace, gifts of tropical countries, amazing monkeys and even living world trees, but also memories of an amazing land. Here is a relief which is carved from the temple and is now kept in the Cairo Museum. This is the Tsar Punt Parek and his wife Atia. And there were a lot of attempts to identify what is with her. The simplest diagnosis they put in the literature is that it is a steatophagia, but the Egyptian artist with incredible details showed all the luxury of the accuracy of this lady. There's also an image of a donkey and a separate commentary. And this is a donkey she rides. There's such a sad regret in this phrase because she shocked the artist with her incredibly accurate forms. But in general, this is a rarity for Egypt. That is, it was something absolutely exotic, which is quite typical for tropical African countries, where ladies of such forms are considered the standard of beauty. There is no such thing in Egypt. The Egyptian standard of a woman is completely different, but I cannot show this example. Speaking of the attention with which the Egyptian artist approaches the image of a person, I will give these three examples from different tombs from the middle of the 3rd millennium to the new era. These are various forms of a heron. These are just workers who catch fish, hunt in the Nile swamps, swim on boats. But still, the Egyptian artist does not just depict some people there, he depicts those whom he saw. And this incredible detail is, of course, a muezzin. And here are depicted both herons and perhaps 2 cases of filharia. It happens very rarely in Egypt. I saw it once. It was very scary. There was a madman on the road in central Egypt with incredibly inflated genitals with swollen elephant-like legs. This infection is spread by a mosquito. Basically, this is still the disease that is associated with tropical Africa, not with Egypt. But apparently there were such examples, and here may be an example of such a disease. Of course, there is a lot that we know about ancient Egypt. Ancient Egyptian medicine was associated not only with surgery but also with injuries. First, I will show you a very funny drawing of a painting from the tomb of the royal artist Ipui in the 13th century BC. Two large altars of Naus. These are wooden boxes, carved, gilded, painted, in which the statues of the gods will be placed. So look, I hope you can see the Latin letters that are here. Let's start from the upper left edge. Comrade H could not hold on, and with a hammer he falls on the poor man who, with the letter B, is already feeling bad, because first of all he has already got shavings in his eyes, and then a man named A has already dropped a hammer on his foot. Then someone from above, extremely lower left figure. The man is honestly trying to do his job, not knowing yet that an old man is flying on him from above. He does not yet see that his fate has been decided. The man C, with the help of a needle or a cane, takes out a subterranean object from the eye of the man with the letter D. Further, at the top, the letters E and F are used to correct the dislocated shoulder. This practice is known. I will give a modern example. This is how the shoulder is corrected using one of the techniques. This is a shot from the British clinic. Nothing has changed under this sky. This practice has existed since the times of Ramses the Great. And of course, there is an author's order. The artist himself must have seen a lot in his lifetime, so he does not immediately understand that this is a joke. Nevertheless, such an incredible amount of traumatic work of the artist is perfectly depicted here. As we have already begun to talk, specialization in Egyptian medicine was, as you understand, in papyrus, but I want to go a little deeper. The temple in Kamombo in the south of Egypt, not far from Aswan, is an amazing, beautiful temple complex that was completed in the construction of his dreams Tsar Ptolemy VI. That is, this is already the Greco-Roman period. Nevertheless, the temple is built absolutely according to the Egyptian canon, if we do not take into account these incredibly magnificent composite capitals columns, which were characteristic for the very end of the existence of the Egyptian civilization. The temple has two axes. One axis is dedicated to Sebek, the great crocodile, the god of the Nile water. Under the temple itself were once the famous caves of Samun, where the giant sacred crocodiles were buried. The largest crocodile in Samun is more than 8 meters long. The other axis, which is more interesting to us today, was dedicated to Kor, the great god of surgery, not just medicine but surgery. And here, among the numerous traditional images of Kor with the head of a falcon walking with his wife, among such traditional images there are absolutely amazing ones, which are also considered such a classic of those examples that are mentioned when they speak of Egyptian medicine. Kor himself sits, and in front of him is the necessary receptor. I am interested in the central part of the relief, which I will now show you in the form of a drawing, so that it is easier for you to see. Saws for trepanation, various probes, tongs, necessary cups for drawing, such as ladles, and what is most amazing, different types, not just tongs, but also scissors. I will show you Egyptian scissors today. This is an ancient Egyptian invention too, but this in fact is not just a relief depicting something. The Egyptian canon depicts what lies next to it in consecutive upper registers. This is the table of an Egyptian surgeon, and this is very interesting. Moreover, in addition to the fact that there are classical surgical instruments here, even under D7 there is a sponge, but there is also C8. There are scales to measure medicines. And the medicines themselves, here is B2, for example, here is a bag. They are also present along with such beautiful saws as A3 and A8, which accordingly already had a clear specialisation inside the Egyptian surgeon's desk. Due to the fact that metal was very valuable and similar things melted after use, then of course such an image is just a treasure. There's one more very interesting thing. There are indirect indications that often, if a patient could afford it, then he ordered medical instruments for himself. Because what concerns your personal blood, here is already a pure classical magic of the Egyptian consciousness. It has a direct connection with you. When after balsamization there were some rags in the blood, you understand that is, something was left there, not some important organs, but rags in the blood, some hair, something else. All this was collected in a bag, closed with a sculptural image of the deceased. It was called tekenu. This tekenu was also placed in the tomb so that everything would go with the person. Therefore, if you were a rich Egyptian, then you ordered from a doctor free of any magic influence of someone else's blood instruments. And on the other hand, think about such a completely indirect but wonderful story about hygiene. Because there are a lot of infectious diseases, only the parasites of worms are described as 14 species. From round to those that caused the main problem of Egypt, it ended somewhere in the 1970s. This is bilharziosis. These are parasites that penetrate through the skin. These parasites live in the coastal waters of the Nile, which is why today it is not recommended to swim in the Nile. In fact, you can only swim on the stream, only in the centre of the river. They penetrate a person, they destroy his urinary system quite strongly. So when the French soldiers arrived in Egypt with Napoleon, they were horrified and said that Egyptian men bleed as well as women in critical days. Then, with this blood, sorry for the details on my medicine, the intermediate forms of this parasite disappear into the water, and there the cycle repeats. They accordingly live for a certain period of their life cycle in coastal mollusks, and then again get into their new carrier. Bilharziosis or schistosomatosis is a very big problem of Egypt. It is now solved. In the 1960s, 12% of the country's population was ill. It was a very big trouble, which fortunately now Egypt has almost finished. Here you must understand that this danger of infection and in general a completely normal medical attitude to liquids from another body also took place in Egypt. How do you like it? Absolutely remarkable. Golden scissors, they were used as pincers in the 14th century BC in the tomb of the architect Ha, which is completely taken out in the Egyptian Museum in Turin. There are bronze scissors. Absolutely amazing Egyptian invention, which we all know very well. I ask you to turn off the flash because I do not want to disturb the atmosphere in the hall. Cutting. There are several important points on which I will dwell. First, there was a cutting, but it was not everywhere. For example, some royal mummies were not cut. For example, there was no cutting, but somewhere about 90% of the male population was cut. Here's a famous relief from the tomb of the great vizier Ankh-Mahor. This is the 25th century BC. It is about the cutting of young men who will be priests of Kamuka, priests of the late cult. The inscription on the left says, "Hold him tight so that he does not fall." They answer him, "Yes, I will do so that you will praise me." That is my action, will call your praise. And accordingly, this practice was not as early as, for example, in Judea. Usually a boy was cut in the 5th to 7th year of his life. There was no strict canon here either. Cutting was rather a ritual entry into the status of an adult man. A couple of noblemen were very proud that, as they said, I got my position even before the cutting was made on me. Unfortunately, in the 18th to 19th century, it is already clear when Egypt was in full swing. Mostly in the Islamic culture, women's circumcision was practiced there. In ancient Egypt, never. That is, it is such a rather painless ritual practice. But there was no male circumcision in ancient Egypt. There was no female circumcision in ancient Egypt. It appeared only with the advent of Islam. About the instruments, despite the fact that little was preserved because the metal was valued, I will show you a fantastic example. The upper example is the needles which were made at the end of the 4th millennium BC. This is the culture of Akkad. This is before the Pharaohs of Egypt. The lower needles, which are packed in such a case made of board bones, are younger. This is the 15th century BC, and the other is the collection of the Petrie University College. This is London. And here, of course, the delicacy of the work is incredible. We have a sufficient number of examples of sewn wounds, not only sewn cavities through which the insides of the body of the embalmers were hit, and the practice itself. Remember what I told you about sewing the lips of the wound so that the wound does not open its mouth. This was connected with the Egyptian concept of voice. The heart in medical papyruses with vessels speaks. If the heart speaks exactly as it should, it means it is good. If the heart speaks with interruptions or is silent, it means it is a problem. A silent heart is a diagnosis that a person will die. And accordingly, this idea of speaking as alive and silent as dead also applies to the wound. A good wound is silent. That is, its lips are closed and it ceases to exist. And of course, such needles and such tools show how highly it was developed. Yes, they did trepanation of the skull. There are indications for trepanation of the skull when a person, for example, when he is all on fire and when his eyes do not see well. That is a description of increased blood pressure. This example was taken in the Nubian Museum in Eswania. This is the end of the 4th millennium BC. Here, of course, trepanation was most likely a ritual. See the spot on the forehead? It is grown. It is grown beautifully. A person lived after that. And there are quite a lot of such examples of trepanation. There are very good examples of magnificently formed and grown bones. This material is rarely studied by Egyptologists. But here you see, even in the signature, in 1608, when the first Aswan Dam was built, the British, American and outstanding scientist George Eisner, he raised a lot of bodies from the necropolis just to save human bodies from the incoming water. And then, due to the fact that there were a lot of them, it was decided to put interesting medical traces on them and see how these people lived. These are people who lived with these trepanations, that is, very accurately jewellery made bones. It is clear that the composition of the bones was later supposed to use wooden blocks that were put on the bone, and thus urgent bones are also not a rarity. Surprisingly, there were prostheses in ancient Egypt. In the 15th century BC, this lady lived. This is a woman's leg. For some reason we do not know, she lost her big toe. Accordingly, from the black wood, that is, from the material, very noble and expensive, this finger was cut out, which, with the help of a special lining, it was tied to the foot. And accordingly, in sandals, it looked quite organic, although it is clear that the woman did not walk so easily. But nevertheless, This passion for the integrity of the body and of course for aesthetics. The girl still wanted to have full limbs. Then this passion for aesthetics led to the fact that together with the mummy, which unfortunately did not survive very well, this prosthesis went to the tomb. It was not the only prosthesis, and this is also a completely amazing feature of Egyptian medicine, stomatology. I have already said that teeth are just trouble, colossal abscesses. Here is the mummy's jaw. But here, the mummy's jaw carries a completely different interest for me. It was fastened with a bracket after the jaw was broken. You see, there is a hole from the bracket. Yes, there was no idea about the defeat of the caries. They imagine that the worm gets into the tooth. The worm should be driven by a large amount of natron, various toothpaste and so on. But if the worm won, then the problem had to be solved in this way. These are golden bridges using someone else's teeth. That is, someone else's teeth were taken. And yet, despite the golden wire, the aesthetics of the jaw was preserved. In some cases, teeth from the ivory bone were used for such a conditional prosthesis. Nevertheless, here is the lower jaw from the collection of the Petrie Museum. This is the 19th century. The upper jaw with such an impressive golden plate is the lady's jaw. It is known from which body this fragment of the skull is from. This is the 14th century. Here it is done aesthetically. The lady had a thin golden stripe on her teeth. No one else in the ancient world could afford such an approach to a sufficiently effective and aesthetic solution of a big problem with falling teeth. There were always a lot of them. I will show you a very interesting story. Here is the mummy of Ramses the Great, one of the most famous mummies of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. He lived to a very old age, about 90 years. The last one was in 1967. He survived 13 of his own elder sons. 12. The 13th son, Merneptah, became his successor. He had bright red hair because he was related to the blood of the Hyksos, the famous nomads who conquered Egypt for a short period between the 17th and 16th centuries before the new era. When Ramses was quite old, his hair was dyed with henna to make his natural red hair look more or less organic. There were many problems, and we would probably never know about them. But it was Ramses the Great who became the first body to receive a full medical certificate in 1975. An outstanding lady of French Egyptology, Christiane de Roche-Noblecourt, to whom we owe a campaign to save the Nubian monuments. It was she, pardon me for such a twist, who took Wahapka Sarwata Akasha, the then Minister of Culture of Egypt, to UNESCO with a request to save the temple from the light bulb. That's what it sounded like. Abu Simbel was saved. A lot was done. After that, the status of de Roche in the Egyptian government was extremely high. She went to the Cairo Museum and suddenly realized that there was a terrible smell coming from the showcase with the body of Ramses the Great and the history of the monuments she devoted her entire life to. The body began to decompose. It was covered with mushrooms, several types of mushrooms. Due to the fact that the humidity regime was not maintained, trouble began with the body. As a result, she got away from Sadat, and the body of Ramses flew out on a military plane to Paris. There, at the Institute of Man in 1976, the body was fully examined. It was later returned to the box filled with inert gas. It was conserved. It was the first attempt to save the body. As a romance, the great Christian de Roche-Noblecourt and her husband ordered a giant blue velvet towel in the Louvre embroidered with golden heraldic lilies of Upper Egypt, which covered the royal sarcophagus when he flew from Paris back to Cairo. In the publications now you see X-ray of the mummy of Ramses. He had a tooth collapse. He suffered terribly. Moreover, one of the abscesses was so large that it pierced, just rotted the jawbone. There was an assumption, no more than an assumption, that maybe this abscess could be the cause of the royal death. The heaviest form of arthritis. He walked hard. He was 90 years old. He was very tall. He was very tall for ancient Egyptians. He was about 1.87 meters tall. It was a very tall height for an Egyptian at that time. A significant number of other diseases were identified in the royal mummy. This was probably the first story when the royal body was saved from decomposition. Then a kind of moratorium, a kind of taboo on the study of royal mummies was stopped. Of course, when we look at surgery, trepanation of the skull, a question arises whether they knew the anaesthesia. They knew it. Here's a very interesting example. At the 15th century BC is a vessel of a specific Cypriot type in which they extract of opium poppy. Initially, the pharaohs understood the danger of all this. These ingredients were imported to the royal house from Cyprus, where the traditional oriental poppy grew. This means was under special account of the royal house. And the same account perhaps was for the most expensive varieties of royal wine from the elite royal vineyards. Then in the first millennium BC, when Egypt will come into crisis, the poppy itself will begin to grow in Phobaide, and the Greek doctors praise the poppy that was imported from Fife to Greece. This very wise system was broken, and the drug came to Egypt. In addition to the fact that the poppy was used, which the Egyptian texts call shapen or shapenin, the wine infusion of the cuts of the mandragora root was used to create ritual drinks for the goddess of the mother, which caused ecstatic intoxication. In the medicine of the mandragora, it was also used. There are such evidences. And a very simple example, which for me, for example, is the most amazing. A specific fortress of vinegar was poured on the porous spruce. Further, the substance that stands out in the form of gas causes a slight loss of consciousness, slight poisoning. This was also used for painkillers, and the oldest cases of use of the poppy, which we know they are dated from the 20th and 19th centuries BC. And this, of course, is absolutely amazing. And this, of course, helped the Egyptian doctors to achieve results. In particular, in the papyrus of Edwin Smith, there is a description of a surgical operation on the removal of the nipple on the glands. That is, you understand, this is a strip operation on the neck. And then, in a special way, the papyrus comments that the surgeon with his obsidian knife should not violate two main methods, that is, the arteries that are in the throat. And then it is described that this procedure, this operation, can be done only by a very experienced doctor who really knows all the secrets of the human body. In order to prepare the recipe, to make it correct, after all, pharmacopoeia was very difficult. Judging by the preserved description, the canon of proportions was taken. The basis of the canon of proportions was this wonderful symbol, the great eye of the god Hora, which is called Ujat. This symbol has a direct relationship to the legend when the god Hora defeated the spirits of chaos and in every possible way contributed to the resurrection of his deceased father Osiris, the ruler of another world. As the last, the most important such ritual victim, realizing that his father could not correct the death of his father-in-law, he gives him to swallow the eye that he had previously torn out by the enemy during the battle. And after swallowing this eye, the rising green eye of Udjat, the symbol of eternal life, Osiris begins to be reborn and thus becomes the first of those who defeated death. As a result, the eye of Hora-Udjat becomes a canonical whole that's divided into pieces. This is how the Egyptian pieces look like. The left column is part of the eye of Hora, half, quarter, 1/8, 1/16, 1/32 or 1/64. Hieroglyphic meaning, and additionally the world in the row. This is the world of scattered things. Now I will tell you a little more about scattered worlds. There is one very interesting philosophical thing here. If in modern mathematics one is 64, 64th, then the ancient Egyptian is 63, 64th, because the world is imperfect. And 64, 64th only in the world of the gods, and we have 63, 64th. Accordingly, on the basis of these pieces, the mathematics was very serious, but cumbersome, of course, the necessary ingredients. Then we had to measure the substances. These are the measuring cups. These are the measuring cups from the 16th century to the new era, which are kept in the Petrie Museum. This is the University College. There was an idea about such a measure of scattered bodies as hekat. It can be quadruple, double, simple. Further, even smaller measures, henu and rho. Henu is 1/10 hekat and rho is 1/320 hekat. And then you see the modern equivalent in litres, that is 14 millilitres, the minimum that was used to make the medicine. Considering that this practice with hekat and rho is well known during the construction of the great pyramids of Giza, that is, we already know it in the texts from the end of the 27th century to the new era, how ancient it is, how much it goes back to Egypt. Of course, it's impossible to say. There already begins pre-written culture. In Egypt was developed what we would today call physiotherapy. It was usually done by people who ruled some bulging parts of the body, or it was just masseurs. And by the way, it was very developed, what I'm showing you here: hand and foot massage, finger massage, and I think I'll voice it. I specifically put you here the translation of the top plate. The head of the treasury of Henu, a very high-ranking nobleman, also came to the reception. "Do it pleasantly, dear." "I'll do it to praise you." The doctor he came to answers him. "The middle relief, do it. It is clear that there is only a piece of this verb left, but it is clear. Do it pleasantly, dear." Then he answers him. And the lower example from the tomb of the already known to you Vizier Ankh Mahor. He is massaged with a finger. "Do it pleasantly, dear." "I'll do it to praise you." The doctor he came to answers him. "The middle relief. Do it pleasantly, dear." That is, this is such an ancient Egyptian physiotherapy office, massage office, and various other medical services where such a high-ranking gentleman turned. Naturally, Egyptian medicine carried a religious subtext, and without this subtext, the concept of Egyptian medicine and medical services cannot be understood. In the 15th century BC, this exceptionally beautiful monument, this is the cult statue of the goddess Sekhmet. Her name is translated as powerful. This is on the one hand the main patroness of diseases in the mythology of ancient Egypt, and on the other hand the great mother of medicine. All Zunu, all doctors are priests of the great lion-headed mother of gods, flaming licum, drinking blood, living in abundance, suppressing man. These are all titles from a large list of the great goddess. According to legend, once in the early days, people rebelled against the sun god, and this rebellion was buried in the blood of the great daughter of the sun god. Initially, she had the appearance of Kador, the great goddess of love, but in anger at the betrayal that people committed, she took the appearance of the lion-headed Sekhmet, a sign that the goddess Sekhmet is extremely ambivalent, dual. She has on the one hand a lion face and a sunlit sun disk on her head, and on the other hand a sceptre that she holds in her hand. This is the stem of the papyrus. Waj is a symbol of youth, health and life. In her other hand, in her right hand, she also holds a symbol. It is not very clearly visible here, but believe me, there is Ankh. There is a symbol of eternal life. According to Egyptian ideas, once a year, Sekhmet releases a certain force that is called Iadet. These are the angry forces of the mother goddess. The Iadet appears every day, twice, in the morning and at noon. What is Iadet? Diseases, epidemics, epizootics, misfortune, wars, anger. She has servants who look like fire arrows. These are her red arrows. She has servant stimulators who strangle in a dream. This is Eputio. There are a whole suite of demons, spirits, absolutely incredible things. The generalization of the forces of Iadet was depicted in the image of a cobra with a lion's head. On the fragment of the wall of the temple of Asida and Dendera, there are these wonderful images of the anger of the mother goddess. In the temples, a special, very complex service was carried out, which was called Udanet. Udanet means flying, glorification of the goddess. In the basis of this flying, there are offerings, pacification, the story that she will give birth to a baby in her womb, everything that should pacify so that she would appear again as the great goddess of love. But it was Sekhmet, the great ruler of all doctors, and not only doctors but also specific priests who wore the title Wabu Sekhmet, the head of purification ceremonies of the goddess. And this is a separate service of the Egyptian veterinary doctors. Wabu Sekhmet worked with animals. Given how many sacred animals are in the temples, it is clear that they also had a lot of medical experience. Based on the concept of Iadet, a calendar of happy and unhappy days was developed. This is a calendar from the Harura temple in Kamombo, which you already know. Sekhmet goes, here are the calendar tables that indicate the happy and unhappy time. All small deities that are somehow related to the lion-headed Sekhmet or other lion-headed goddesses of Egypt, for example, Bastet. Bastet is originally a lion-headed goddess. The shape of the cat is obtained only in the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, when the cat is associated with superiority, affection, sexuality. Before that, Bastet was a formidable goddess. All small deities are also associated with the dangerous cult of their mother and the ability to pacify her. In the centre of the frame there is a silver statuette of god Nefertum, the son of the goddess Sekhmet and the god Ptah, the same luxurious colour relief image of the 14th century BC from the tomb of Horemheb. Nefertum is the god of the forces of nature, the fragrant water lily that we have in Dre. It is a symbol of the triumph of the new day. It is a symbol of all the mysterious potentials of herbal medicine. All plants are subordinate to Nefertum, and it is also the god of herbal poisons. Everything is ambivalent, everything is binary. If Nefertum is the son of Sekhmet, then Bastet, who I have already mentioned, has another son. I will say 2 words about him now. First, there is a special alabaster stone tile with 7 holes. These are 7 oils of the god Nefertum. Each of them has its own name. They were used both in medicine and very actively. They were used in the funerary ritual to cleanse the mouth of mummies and to prepare the exile of the dead to other worlds. This is how the Egyptian iconography depicts Mahes. Mahes is the son of the goddess Bastet. He is the god of the storm, and from time to time he is also the deity of parasitically transmitted diseases. He is a lion that devours the prisoner who is in front of him. And on the lion's head there is a sacred falcon with an emblem of a water lily and 2 feathers. It is not by chance that I mention that these deities are associated with special diseases, especially dangerous ones, because the main disease that is transmitted by Semet is the plague. The plague came to Egypt many times. The worst example is the Golden Age of Egypt. It is the 14th century BC, and as I often say at lectures, the Golden Age of Egypt is an absolutely clear relationship. The Golden Age of Egypt is the trade of people. When there is no war, when there is peace, when there is art, there is trade. Trade is ships. Ships are rats. Rats are the plague. The plague was so violent that the whole court fled to Memphis, to the northern capital, and the goddess Araku predicted the cure in the case that the mother will be revered as no one revered her. As a result, a monumental flying in granite, that is, a monumental glorification of the deity. When Amenhotep III made more than 800 goddess statues, most of the titles that are inscribed on the statues are not repeated. One of these statues, a magnificent granite diorite, is kept in St. Petersburg at the Assembly of the State Hermitage. The most terrible, the plague itself, is a terrible disease. The Egyptian texts describe it. I will tell you a little more about it later. But first of all, the plague causes, as you well understand, a dense cluster of people who live in dense clusters. This is the military, this is the priesthood, and these are the artists. After the plague, there was such a decline of art in the Fives for several years that it is clear that the royal house had to bring artists from other regions of the country to become an art school. But not only Egypt suffered terribly from this. I remind you that in the 5th century before the new era, the plague fell, for example, on the classical Athens. That is, we imagine Athens as Pericles and Aspasius, and then the whole ceramic died. That is, the best masters who made classical antique vases, and many technologies were lost forever. For a very long time, in principle, we could not understand, in addition to textual indications, how the plague was spreading in Egypt. The medievists helped. In the 80s, the first tests were put when in the tooth pulp buried in the plague pits in the south of France were found incisive traces of the plague Vibrion, and then the tooth pulp became an amazing material that allowed to show the plague. And, by the way, the DNA of the Tsar's mummies is also mainly derived from the tooth pulp. It is there that the material is biologically preserved better than anywhere else. Naturally, not only the world of gods, but also the world of demons. Demons were considered the sources of diseases. They enter the marrow, the vessels, I remind you, and then through the heart, together with blood and air, as the ancient Egyptians believed, they spread throughout the body. I ask you to love and pity, or rather, may God save you, love and pity. This is Sekahek. This is a demon of migraine. This is a child, a nubide. That is, he is like this, with black skin. He has curly hair. He is always hungry. He is blind. He looks for his victim by smell, and at the same time, forgive me, he has a tongue in his anus in which he collects impurities, turning them, think, into bodily horror. Here, such a cute child, on an ostracon, on the sketches of an artist from the 13th century to the new era. This ostracon is kept in Leipzig. There are a lot of such examples, and special attention is paid to demons of migraine, for example, in many medical texts. But nevertheless, this description, of course, amazes on the one hand. On the other hand, also contains very important aspects of how the Egyptian saw the world around him. I have already told you about the Brooklyn snake papyrus. So in a nutshell, I will only remind you that the Egyptians were very good at disassembling snakes. The stele of the carrier of Apahal to the right of His Majesty, whose name was Kenacht, is a large figure of a snake with a human face. This is Renenutet. This is the owner of the crop, living in the fields, and also one of the owners of all snakes, which are depicted here on this beautiful stele from the 13th century to the new era. It is curious that in the list of snakes, which I told you about at the very beginning, I will later give a link where you can see an absolutely detailed zoological description. What colour, what skin, what ornament, what shape of teeth, what teeth. Then accordingly there is a verdict, there is a diagnosis. From this bite will die, from this can be healed, from this will be healed, so. It is curious that in the Brooklyn snake papyrus, snake number 1, it is mythological. This is Apop, the great snake chaos with which the sun fights in another world. And there is also a detailed description and a course, and the outcome is lethal. If you are bitten by a great snake chaos, well, I'm sorry, but no doctor will save you from this. A separate category of priests, which were called not just Zunu, but Herb Selkit, the senior priestess of the goddess Selkit. It was associated with the treatment of scorpion bites. The incredible image of the goddess of the 7th century BC is kept in the Louvre. This is how Selkit was depicted, and sometimes this was also depicted by Sid Hedidet, one of the forms of Side, and there were many scorpions. It was a constant problem of the Nile Valley. Now they have gone into the desert, and in general, in the Egyptian house, you do not meet them so often, only quite in the oasis, probably remote. But there is one very interesting thing inside the medical community. The scorpion conjurers were a special closed clan. It is absolutely amazing. But still in Egypt, in the area of Edfu, in the south of the country, there's a closed clan of scorpion conjurers. They are called out if a scorpion appears. I once saw how it happens. This is a knocking, cracking, knocking on the ground, and indeed the scorpions come out on them. Then he catches it and accordingly passes it on. On the one hand, the great mother of gods, she is angry. On the other hand, it is the highest mercy. It is probably it that shows as the main owner medical art in Egypt, a striking monument of the 6th century until the new era. Sekhmet with wings. Behind her is the female of the Congreve, another of her sacred animals, attracts this unfortunate baby, feeds him with his breast, because breastfeeding is a gift of great mercy. It is in the temples of the Mother of Gods were the most famous hospitals of ancient Egypt. One of them I will show you, Ayenet Tenekrit, the unparalleled land of the goddess, which is known today as Dendera, the famous temple of the goddess Hathor, famous for its architecture, its stunning dungeons, its incredible ceilings of the central pronaos, which have so far preserved this incredible, genuine turquoise blue painting, which reflects the Egyptian idea of the heavenly world, tells about the hours of the day and night, about constellations, about planets, including about the zodiac signs. Since the temple is late, Only in the 2nd century BC, as we know, that zodiacal ideas and astrology, which is originally not Egyptian at all, and the Indo-Babylonian science comes from Egypt. Until the 2nd century BC, there was no astrology in Egypt, there was only astronomy. But this is not what interests us today. What interests us is what can be seen by rising to the roof of the temple and looking down. This structure in front of you is the famous sanatorium of Dendera. This is one of the preserved hospitals of the ancient world. What did it look like? It was a central courtyard. From the central courtyard, there were chambers where the patients were kept. Both patients with some kind of physical illness and people with psychiatric problems, because there were methods of treatment of addiction. We know about this, but the main thing is the feeling of a hospital that is like a central courtyard on the sides of the chamber, but in the centre there was a healing statue, because all the medical solutions that the Egyptian doctor are built, if it is a water-soluble medicine, on holy water. Now I will first show you how the hospital looks closely. Here is such a structure. Of course it was better seen from above, but look again. This is one of the amazing preserved hospitals of the ancient world, and this is how healing statues look like. The 4th century BC, in the city of Atrabes in the north of Egypt, this statue was found. It was once a very famous doctor and priest and magician, of course, too. His name was Jethor. His whole figure is covered with spells. These spells literally take every millimetre of the surface of his body. In front of him, on his feet, like this, under his hands, is an image of a young man who beats snakes and scorpions. Then water was poured on the statue. Water was collected in a container that is located at the feet of the statue. Notice how it is erased. This is granite, my friends. And then this water was used, first of all, to create the necessary medicine. And on the other hand, like for example, holy water in Christianity, it was used for cleansing or sanctifying ceremonies. There was always in the centre of the hospital yard another curious thing. Sometimes there were rooms in hospitals where people who did not walk could use this holy water, and then when such water was taken out from this container, a special gutter was poured and water flowed into these rooms so that a person who was unable to move, a lying patient, could somehow draw this sacred liquid and help himself. This principle that Haika, the magic power of the text or a spell, is able to enter the water and then be used. It was the basis of many ideas of the Egyptian religion. We have already seen an image of the choir of the infant. Now I am showing you a triumphant example. This is the famous Stella Metternich, which is kept in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum in New York. This is the 4th century BC. Stella has an author, a certain Nesatum, who was one of the priests of Nineveh, the sacred bull of the sun god in Heliopolis, the ancient city of the sun, on which are now northeast quarters of Cairo. Nesatum, according to various sources, was a priest, a tomb, a temple text. He collected the most complete history of how the sacred water, it was displayed on the stela. We are talking about a very interesting way of sympathetic magic. Do you understand that this is the opposite side of this monument? This is the same. According to the legend of Isis, a special nest, which is shown here on the left, she gave birth to her son, the heiress, a choir of infants, hid him in the swamps of Akbit, in the pre-eternal top of the delta, in a special nest which was made of reed. And at that moment, the child, whom she hid from enemies and from the evil forces, was bitten by snakes, scorpions, crocodiles, in general, all the horror, including tarantulas or some spiders. And then, when she came home and returned to this nest, she saw him breathless. The mother's cry was so terrible that it stopped the movement of the sunbed. And then, using her magic powers, the powers of God Tote, the god of wisdom, the great Isis, healed her baby. Since then, it is believed that since she healed her baby, so everyone will be healed. This especially concerned the bites of snakes, scorpions, and other dangerous creatures, which are squeezed in the hands of the choir of Paharedu, the choir of infants, kicking them with their crocodile feet. A mandatory element of such steles of the choir, or as they are sometimes called in the science of the chain, were the massive masks of the god Bes, the great defender of motherhood, childhood, and in general, the house of Egypt from all evil. The fact that such steles were watered, and this water later became sacred. By the way, for the first time in the 19th century, this was determined as a result of his research by the outstanding father of Russian Egyptology, Vladimir Semyonovich Galinichev. This is Galinichev's discovery. On the reverse side, the same Bes, which is perceived here as the bear of secret power, he is here Bes Panteos, Bes in many ways. He has wings, hands, he holds sacred in his hands, harpoons and arrows beating chaos. Around him is a fiery orbit. That is, all these signs around him are signs of flame, and he, stepping over a snake that bites his own tail, is able to bring magical power that will penetrate this water and will be used for healing. I will show several images of Bes Panteos. This is the famous Louvre Bes Panteos. He comes out here, steps over the border of this world, which is expressed in the image of a snake biting its tail, Ouroboros, the snake of infinity. He comes out of this world. His whole body is covered with the hieroglyph of the eye. That is, he is all-seeing, he is omnipresent, and he is able to be filled with that magical, positive power that medicine is filled with, which is made on the basis of water, such as stele. In medicine, Bes has always been associated with various rituals which women used when she wanted to start. On the one hand, on the left, there is an amazing cult statue of Bes of the 4th century to the new era from Asia, Bahariya, and in the west of Egypt. And on the other hand, archival shooting is actually an image of Bes with her husband, who adorned underground catacombs in the necropolis of Saqqara, 30 kilometers south of Cairo. And in these catacombs, rituals of incubation, rituals of divine sleep were performed, which were also often elements of important procedures for the Egyptian doctor, that is, both medical treatment and such divine treatment. In medicine, there were always images of mothers of gods, great goddesses. On the left, Isida holding her son on her lap. On the right, Tort, a great image of motherhood, which was represented as the main protective image, because the female hippopotamus is able to tear everything that comes in her way, protecting her children. Therefore, it is based on the sign of Se, on the sign of magical protection. In the 6th century BC, the Tsarist poet Pabasa ordered this statue, and judging by the inscription on its pedestal, he also ordered it in order to be cured of some disease. Ned Ikeret, the great priestess of Karnak, the great wife of God, to whom he served. Here's another interesting example of the medical connection with magic, a healing statue which a certain donor erected to heal his mistress. Tart plays a big role on magical vases of the Middle Kingdom, That is, these are all monuments of the 21st to 18th centuries BC. Such vases were framed the bed of the warrior in order for demons of birth and other evil spirits not to be able to penetrate it. Here is another example of the combination of magic and medicine. I also love this monument. It is from the meeting of the Metropolitan Museum in New York. This is a cup of a magician that he used to feed a small child. All the animals on the frieze that decorate this monument, including down here and Bess and Bessid, his wife, are designed not to allow the evil spirit to enter the milk that will be fed to the sick child. In ancient Egypt, special importance was given to the milk of a woman who gave birth to a son, the son of the firstborn. At this moment, she is associated or even completely identified with the goddess Isis, so the infused milk of such a woman was stored in such vessels. This is a vessel from the 15th century to the new era from the Louvre, and then it was also used as an important ingredient in the preparation of one or another medical remedy. Another way of magic medicine that is characteristic for many cultures, not only for Egypt, is when they took an image of a sick organ and brought it to the temple of the goddess of God in order to cure it. A huge number of thousands of images of phalluses, images of female genitals, breasts, arms, legs. These are just a few examples from the Petrie University College Museum. They all come from the temple of Hatshepsut in Deir el-Bahri, where in one of the sanctuaries the great goddess Hathor was worshipped, and accordingly by sacrificing the sick part of her body, the donor hoped for healing. And finally, the last two deities associated with medicine. On the left is the god Thoth, the great god of wisdom, magic, the moon, the creator of Medu-Neter, the divine letter, as the ancient Egyptians called their written tradition. He was worshipped as the keeper of Per-Ankh. Per-Ankh is the house of life. It is a temple sanctuary, a laboratory, including a medical one, in particular very large medical texts describing what Per-Ankh they are created. He is one of the great keepers of the Egyptian doctor. On the right is Khonsu, another god of the moon. His name is translated as stranger. This is the traditional deity of the city of Thebes. It is a deity of incurable diseases, including. In particular, in the Egyptian texts are commented special categories of diseases. I'll give you one example. He is lying next to me. How they classified diseases. Vahadu, suffering. Vahedi is a sufferer. Or Vahedith, if of female origin, suffering. This is a patient. Such Vahedi came. He has a problem. Most likely he can be cured. This is the everyday term of the Egyptian doctor. It is curious that several texts, which are called the Book on the Redemption of Vahidu, that is from Naduga, they have a reference to some ancient times when they were found under the feet of the statue of the god Anubis. Here's another interesting thing. Anubis is the god of balsam, and we have several examples when outstanding Egyptian doctors were the grandchildren of a balsamist. That is this tradition of understanding the secret of the body. For Egypt, it is a mysterious thing. It went from balsam to medicine. Setet. The definition of this word in the form of the skin of an animal pierced by an arrow. This is acute pain. Everything that is acute pain, everything that is associated with surgical diseases, diseases that are solved by surgery. This is all setet. That is, it is very painful, but it is curable. There's a very bad thing. This is AA. It's 3 letters A. It literally transmits the cry of a person. This is an incurable disease. And among the diseases, AA especially terrible. This is AA Honsu. this is tumour, this is cancer, and this is rakaza. 3 diseases that were never treated. They try to treat, judging by some texts, the consequences of cancer by surgical methods, but it's clear that it was some kind of attempt. Rakaza was not treated, and nature did not understand it, and accordingly, tumour, which we have already talked about. That is why Honsu, who is depicted in the form of an embalmed child, he is such an eternal child, the life force of which is given to the earth. He has another very terrible title, the one who eats the bread from the bodies of men. But at the same time, he is a great exorcist. All the possessed and all the people with psychiatric diseases went to be treated in his temple. And in his temple there was a very strong priestly school of people. Let's say there was a psychiatric school, as close as possible such a term can be called. About the traces of these diseases, I will give another example. It is so creepy but interesting. This is 2014. This is Fiwa. In the tomb of Harua, who was a high-ranking official in Fiwa in the 7th century BC, Italian archaeologists began to find burnt remains of sarcophagi. This is a frame from the excavation. At first it was not at all clear why it was burned and why everything was sealed. Then a large pillow of a star went, and then under the star there were plague bodies. It turned out that these are traces of the plague that came to Egypt in the 3rd century of the new era, on the eve of the arrival of the Christians. This is the famous epidemic of the Cyprus plague, when 5,000 people died in Rome a day while this epidemic was. It had reached Egypt, and here in the old tomb the furnace was melted with sarcophagi in order to grind the limestone and fill the bodies of the plague patients with this limestone in order to somehow stop the spread of this terrible disease. These are the traces of these bodies that were filled with limestone, and there are vessels with water in order to make it easier to extract limestone in the neighbouring limestone rocks of the necropolis of the Ossetians on the western bank of the Nile in Fiwa. Of course, there's a lot of information, and we are already approaching the final episode of our story about mummies. Here are the simple mummies of the Greek-Roman times, which were found in the necropolis of the god Thoth. In the Gebel tunnel, yes, they are without special masks and amulets, but this is a colossal story, not only of the funeral ritual, but also of what an anthropologist can draw from these materials, and about diseases, and about the traces of treatment. That's all I'm telling you about today. And of course, in short, I can't help but say about some of the famous kings of ancient Egypt. Here is the mummy of Tutankhamun. It was made very badly and soon. Only thanks to the fact that natural science methods, DNA tests, were done in 2010, and it was established not only that he is the son of the famous reformer Akhenaton, whose skull is on top. 2 upper pictures are the skull of Akhenaton. 2 lower ones are the skull of Tutankhamun, but among the nameless mummies of kings, his mother was identified. He was quite tall, 1.75 meters tall. He had one of the syndromes that completely fastened his vertebrae in the neck. Unfortunately, I will not say the medical name now. In general, he could hardly turn his head. Due to the fact that he was the progenitor of incest, this is the child of which Akhenaton gave birth to his own sister. He had a lot of medical problems, incredibly weakened limbs, and all those many dozens, more than 100 reeds that were found in his tomb, they will bear the traces of use. Hatshepsut, the first among the venerable ladies, the great queen of the 15th century to the new era, 22 years of power, one-man rule of the Egyptian state. The most successful pharaoh, a woman on the Egyptian throne. On the right is her amazing sculptural portrait, made of marble, made of limestone, and is now kept in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. On the left is her mummy, which was also identified by DNA analysis. Here is one of the diseases of Khonsu, the most severe oncological disease, a huge tumour that occupied almost more than half of her lower back, which was preserved even in the mummy, and which apparently led to a fatal outcome. Before that, about how the Queen Hatshepsut, and with all the exotic cases, the head of Ramses V's mummy is an ospo. Look at his face, it's all hollow. This is a terrible example of an ospo, although the ospo was more characteristic for Asian countries at that time. In Egypt, apparently, it was brought several times. They were so frightened that after Ramses V's mummy was buried, don't envy the Bolsheviks, by the way, when it was buried in the Valley of Kings. The Valley of Kings was closed for several months to be visited even by guards. They were so afraid of the ospo epidemic. And then, when it was about 5 to 7 years, his brother, who then began to rule like Ramses VI, he opened this small tomb, re-saved his brother with dignity, and completed this tomb, extending it. This is one of the most famous tombs of the Ivan necropolis. Here, in the frame made by Derry, you can see terrible postulates on his face, the brightest case of an ospo in the Egyptian tradition. Well, what about doctors? In a nutshell, just like the tradition of the calendar and its written culture, the Egyptians attributed the medical tradition to the memory of Imhotep, the great wise man who lived in the 27th century BC. He was not only a royal architect who created the first stone structures in the history of mankind for his king Nechirikit, whom the later tradition called Djoser, a sacred ancestor. He built a 60-metre step pyramid, but he was also an astronomer, a priest of Ra, the creator of the calendar, a great magician, and a great Urzun, a great physician. This is one of the highest titles of a doctor that was in the Egyptian tradition. Many legendary medical recipes were passed down to the Egyptians and attributed to the memory of Imhotep, the second legendary doctor, and by the way, also an architect. That is, all these people are absolutely universal in their interests. This is Amenhotep, son of Hapu, the creator of the colonnade of the Luxor temple, an outstanding contemporary of Pharaoh Amenhotep III. His age statue, and unexpectedly for Egyptian art, with a clearly given age from the Cairo Museum, is shown on the right. O people of Karnak, those who came with a prayer in their hearts, tell it to me. Whisper it into my ear, for I am entrusted by His Majesty Amenhotep III to transmit here about earthly affairs. It is written in the text, including the biographical inscription on his knees. The memory was so revered that on one of such statues, a princess who lived a few centuries later wrote an inscription with a prayer to the great doctor of antiquity to heal her of some disease that terribly tormented her body. Amenhotep the 27th, the century before the new era, and Amenhotep, son of Hapu the 14th, the century before the new era, are both depicted in the 2nd century before the new era. That is, a millennium of reverence for this amazing tradition of great wise men. So who do we have? Herib Zunu, the head of the doctors. Heri Zunu, the one who is above the doctors, is the head of the department. Emira Zunu, the head of the doctors. They are all different. He has the function of an inspector, and including the pharmaceutical department. That is, he provides doctors with medicines in the hospital. Sehejzunu, a medical inspector, he always has a connection to a certain province. That is, he is the one who travels around the province and looks after everything. Urzunu is a great doctor, and at the same time he is the chief physician of the hospital. And at the same time he is always Urzunu, the high priestess of the goddess Sekhmet, or another grape goddess. That is, without the grape goddess there is no great doctor. Wonderful title, Emir Gasutide Pepirazunu, who is in charge of the two sides of the ship of the doctors of the palace. This title goes up to the fact that there were two teams of doctors. This is a typical duality of Egyptian culture. Two teams of artists. Remember this title? I'll show you who could wear it. Just Zunu, a doctor. Please note that the Egyptian language is dead. They only spelled consonants or semi-consonants. But this first sound is something between S and Z. And at first it was more likely Z, then S, Zunu, Zunu. All this is appropriate. And the foreign doctors. 4 people appeared in the second transitional period of the New Kingdom, in particular from the house of the king of Babylon, Amenhotep III. With such doctors, when he was ill, they sent a healing statue of the goddess Ishtar. And here are the data on such titles, which were brought by John Nunn, and the structure of this medical community. The contemporary of Amenhotep in the 27th century BC was this amazing man. His name was Hesera. In addition to being one of the chief doctors, he was the oldest dentist in the history of mankind. This is a personal dentist, Tsar Chidjoser, an incredibly rich man, incredibly revered. Apparently, the teeth of Tsar Che are good. There were unique panels in the tomb, madly expensive cedar wood, which depicted the great royal dentist in all his glory. Cairo, the Egyptian Museum, Neri Ruka, the great vizier of Zar Teti, the 24th century BC. It was he who wore the title of chief of all doctors on both sides of the ship, which belonged to the palace. That is, look, the great vizier was a doctor. It was absolutely normal for ancient Egypt. And the example I promised you a long time ago, a woman. Before you is a wonderful drawing of a funerary stela of a lady who was called Pesache, who in the era of the construction of the pyramids of Giza, she was the maître. She was the chief of all the women doctors of the palace. Since the primordial division into the male and female half in the palace, the oldest woman doctor in the history of mankind is now in front of you. More often, of course, it happened that the doctor had several specializations. This is the stela of the Dr. Erti, the 21st century BC. I specially wrote out the titles for you. The Doctor of the Royal Palace, Gastroenterologist of the Royal Palace, Proctologist, Ophthalmologist of the Royal Palace. Yes, in ophthalmology there was a separate discipline. Well, of course, the Inspector of Doctors of the Royal Palace, but without it, in a decent official structure of the ancient East, it would not have happened. But look at one very important thing. In Egypt, when a text is written in relation to a person, the more important the title for him, the closer to the name. And all the parade titles and specializations are far from the name. And the Doctor of the Royal Palace is right in front of the name. That is, the position of a simple doctor was the most important for this person because it gave him a very high status in society. A few more examples. Naib Amon in the 15th century BC, he was a personal doctor of Amenhotep II, and here you see the image of his tomb. A Syrian prince came to him. That is, the Syrian princes went to Egypt for treatment when it was necessary. Doctors passed their traditions, their secrets to their families. Two steles of the royal Dr. Uni, where not only he is depicted before the gods, but also his sons, who inherited the position of Urzun, the great doctor, and the last monument about doctors today. This is a statue of a man called Ujaresne. He lived in Egypt in the 6th century BC, and when the Persian king Cambyses captured Egypt and was crowned as a pharaoh, he found this priest in the city of Sais. Sais is north of Egypt. It is a famous cult centre of the Mother of God with a famous medical school. As you understand, the mystery of Egypt was also shown by Herodotus in Sais, and he was so impressed by the talent of this man called Ujaresne that he took him to Persia, and then he did not leave any important data about his medical school in Sais, and he, judging by the biography that covers the statue in the Museum of Gregory the Great in the Vatican, persuaded the heir of Cambyses, King Darius I, and sent him back to Egypt so that he could update the medical pyramid of the Temple of Sais and pass on his knowledge to his descendants. This is the most exclusive story about how an Egyptian doctor went abroad, returned from there, and interacted directly with a foreign king conqueror through whom he strengthened his own temple school. As a conclusion, I will quickly show you a few frames of a mummy that's kept in the British Museum. This man was called Nesperanub. This is a great illustration of how medicine and natural sciences return to what Egyptologists can study. This man served in the Temple of Homs. He was a priest between the 9th and the 8th century BC. This is what the sarcophagus. This is a mummy case made of soaked canvas foam, and it goes deeper and deeper. Very interesting moments are associated with the fact that you see now an amulet, rings in his hands, golden embellishments on his eyes. He has a bowl that was forgotten by a balsamist. The balsamist was also a living person. He forgot the bowl. Who would have known that this ancient mistake would be hidden more than 3,000 years later? The reason for his death is a hole in his forehead. How he got this hole is not clear. It is definitely not an arrow because it is a small hole, and the snake amulet was placed so that it protected this hole so that the evil spirit did not enter it. This is what the skull looks like. The hole is very visible here. With the help of new technologies of criminal laboratories, anthropologists based on the skull can recreate the face. And you can look at the face of an ancient Egyptian doctor who at the turn of the 9th and 8th centuries in the temple of the god of the moon tried to fight with the most dangerous diseases, and judging by the burial in the aforementioned text was one of the highest professionals of his generation. What to see, my friends? Nothing in Russian, unfortunately. The great John Nunn, Ancient Egyptian Medicine. We have this book in the library, in the reading room. You can browse. I would also recommend to take a picture. There are a lot of books on medicine in European languages and Egyptian. Eschen Strugel, the doctors of Isla, Vakala and Hanov and Maslova, Ancient Egyptian Medicine. Why do I recommend the book? We also have it. The recipe is translated into English, and if you're interested to see what the recipe that the Egyptian sufferer received from the hands of a good doctor, then you need to look at this book. Thank you very much, friends. Thank you for your patience. Thank you